This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word.
Welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer Courtney, Timothy Knotts, and I discuss books from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. It's Wednesday, August 28th, 2024, and I'm Lee Bortons. And once again today, we're joined by Stephanie Meter, a curriculum developer for Classical Conversations Multimedia, and a breath of young air for the rest of us. So thank you, Stephanie, for being so smart and joining us.
All right. Yeah, we love having you, Stephanie. So, and we love this little mini series we've been in, or at least I do, because I loved Challenge 2's British literature. And this is especially meaningful to me this year because I am tutoring Challenge 2 for the 8th time. So I'm enjoying getting to have a little preview of the books that I'm getting ready to discuss with my students. So we're at this is our last week on this little mini series. We've done Robinson Crusoe, Animal Farm, and The Hobbit, which was super fun. And now we're going to have a teary, literally probably a teary goodbye to this month by discussing Malcolm Muggeridge's biography of Mother Teresa, Something Beautiful for God.
Great, thank you for telling us about the shows and reminding us what's on our at Lee Bortons YouTube channel for anybody who wants to hear some of these past episodes. And you can go to leebortons.com in order to click through to our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, and buy any of the books we've discussed in the past or are on our upcoming calendar for 2024. And it's almost time, guys, to get the 2025 calendar up there. Time's going by fast. So what are we talking about today?
All right. Well, I'm going to ask you why Something Beautiful for God by Malcolm Muggeridge, boy, that's a tongue twister, is part of our Challenge 2 curriculum.
Yeah, I don't think everybody always thinks about how we choose the author as well as the book itself. And so it was nice to have a book on Mother Teresa. But Malcolm Muggeridge is a very influential person in all things modern, and a lot of folks don't know who he is anymore. So the book's very pleasant to read. It discusses Mother Teresa, who's famous. It gives some controversy for some Catholics and Protestants to talk about. The title is accurate, Something Beautiful for God. There's a lot of beauty in the book. But one of the reasons I picked the book was because Mother Teresa is a nice balance to another 20th century saint, Elizabeth Elliot, another woman. And then Malcolm Muggeridge is, compatriot with philosopher with Lewis and Tolkien, as well as Orwell. So when we look at our whole CC curriculum, we're trying to determine not just what's the content, but who wrote the content, what periods of time they fit in, not just that they're British literature, but who were their compatriots. And we have the books aligned chronological, so the students have an opportunity to compare the authors as well as the books themselves. So there's just a whole lot of reasons that book's in there. And the other thing about the 20th century is, it's known so much as the age of industry and the age of statism, all the wars we had and how many people died. So we could have focused a whole lot on technology and battles and geopolitical issues. And we do. We have The Discoverers that talks about the exact same, written by somebody from that same time period, Daniel Boorstin, who talks about things from a technological perspective. But I just think it's very important that our students also meet Chuck Colson and Elizabeth Elliot and Mother Teresa, Malcolm Muggeridge, a philosopher, Lewis, a philosopher, so that they can see a whole perspective of things that happened in the 20th century and not your usual just edited textbook of lists of events that have shaped the actual world our children are living in right now. So I'm excited to read this book with you guys.
Yeah, me too. And one of the beautiful things I think about this book, besides the fact that Mother Teresa has a beautiful life and therefore a beautiful story, is thinking about Malcolm Muggeridge as the author, because he wasn't a believer when he met her, and yet he was part of a generation that was really struggling with what they believed and thought. And so one year, my students and I were drawing a big chart of circumstances on the board, and we had this beautiful conversation thinking about the types of educated young people who were coming to Francis and Edith Schaeffer at L'Abri and asking philosophical questions about art and music and history, and then thinking about how Malcolm Muggeridge was so much like those people, that he's encountering Mother Teresa and asking those same questions. And that was really fun moment for us to think about worldwide in that time period, how unsettling it was, and yet how people were still seeking. So, all right. So Tim,
Well, I want to ask Tim, I just
Go ahead.
want to, I appreciate that you brought up Francis Schaeffer. So it's almost like, Jennifer, we need to do a timeline of all of our literature and all the textbooks we read, and see how they are put together so that folks can appreciate that. You might be reading a modern author who's writing about the long past, or a modern author who's writing about the current time that they live in. And that's a conversation I think it would really benefit our tutors in the exposition strand throughout Challenge.
Yeah, that would be fun. Oh, all right. A new topic for Words Aptly Spoken. All right. Well, I think, Tim, as I talked about Malcolm Muggeridge maybe being a seeker, I think that led right into what I was going to ask you, which is that he did grow up agnostic and he did not become a Christian until late in his life. So tell us a little bit about our author and his journey of faith.
Yeah, as Lee was already alluding to, he's a really interesting man. He had a pretty fantastic life, and was well known not just in Christian circles. In fact, maybe better known outside of Christian circles for much of his career. He's an interesting character comparison or contrast to C.S. Lewis. Any of you Challenge students out there interested in writing a comparison essay, that would be a really fascinating one to compare Muggeridge and Lewis. They were contemporaries. Muggeridge a little younger, but not much, than Lewis. He too is a Briton like Lewis, but unlike Lewis, who was raised within the church and was really hard against the gospel of Jesus Christ, despite having been raised in a Christian family. Muggeridge was raised by a socialist activist father, Carlyle, who worked really hard to indoctrinate his son into socialism and communism. So Muggeridge went to university at Cambridge, and then in the 1930s he moved to Moscow. And some people think that he moved there seeking communism, as sort of he was raised in that vein, but others argue that he went there with sort of a jaded eye, looking for evidences against communism. Whichever way, by the time he left Moscow, he was very disillusioned with anything good coming out of communism. He really went from being someone who was somewhere on either moderate or to the left of center to being a staunch conservative during those years. And it really led him into a lot of conflicts with his newspaper editors at that time in the 1930s. They were very much looking to not poke the bear when it came to the socialist powers in the Soviet Union. And so he would write things and then have his editors sort of either deny them or strip parts out of them to keep to try to keep the peace between the Britons and the Soviets. So regardless, and he did write a very critical piece based on the abuse of the Ukrainians by the Soviets, as Ukraine was sort of taken over by the Soviet Union just about 90 years ago, just over 90 years ago now. And man, what a timely thing to be considering in the day and age we live in. He eventually moved to India a couple of different times. One time he went to be a teacher. Another time he went as editor of a paper. Meanwhile, he was friends and in regular correspondence with George Orwell, as Lee already mentioned, which was interesting because, again, Orwell was a fierce critic of socialism as well, as you well know if you've been with us and listened in on our Animal Farm conversation earlier this month. through this, he made a lot of enemies. He was very strong-minded with regard to his opinions, and was at odds again with his editors over the socialism issues. At one point, he wrote some articles criticizing the British monarchy and basically calling them a giant soap opera, which made a lot of people very upset. But he really became most famous in the public sphere as a TV interviewer. So he's very famous for his interview of Mother Teresa that came before the documentary series that he made. That's really the subject of the book that we're talking about today. But one of his other very high-profile TV interviews was actually Billy Graham in 1954. So he became known really as sort of a hard-nosed interviewer, commentator, a man who pulled no punches. And so it was a pretty big change when he went to India in 1969 and made this documentary about Mother Teresa, which made him more and more sympathetic to the Christian faith, though there's some great passages in the book about how, while he was very tempted to go join the church simply to please Mother Teresa, he knew that he couldn't do that. He couldn't, in good faith, literally go and join the church based on her faith. And in the same year, 1969, he wrote a book called Jesus, the Man Who Lives, showed his sort of that questing, that looking for answers in Christianity. And in 1982, he converted to Catholicism and joined the church at the Roman Catholic Church at nearly 80 years old. And his very last book was an autobiographical book called Conversion that he published in 1988. That sort of detailed what he considered his 20th century pilgrimage into faith.
Oh, that's so cool. And I'm glad that you mentioned this idea of, well, first of all, him and Orwell, because the whole time you were talking, I kept thinking about the movie Mr. Jones and that expose of what happened in Ukraine. So that's an interesting connection that we have here between him and Orwell. But also, when you mentioned this being a documentary, this book is more like a script. It's not like a traditional autobiography. And there are a couple books that we read like that in Challenge. So this is one of them. And then going back to Schaeffer, his book, How Shall We Then Live, really is sort of an expanded script for the documentary series that he made. So that's another way that we get our students to have some variety and see these, it's not a novel, it's not an epic poem. These are both basically scripts for another media. So, all right. Well, Stephanie, so what we know about Mother Teresa is that she was quite humble, and she did not like having attention on herself. She considered herself to be a servant of Christ and that he was deserving of all the focus. And therefore, you would logically conclude she didn't really want people to write books about her or film documentaries about her. But tell us a little bit about her and her early life and her calling into ministry.
Yeah, so she was born in Skopje, Yugoslavia in, I think, 1910. And she had a very happy family. And that was actually the only thing that sort of made her hesitate to become a nun. She was sad at the idea of having to leave her family and be away from them. But she did start to feel this call when she was about 12 years old. And so she felt that she was called to be a nun and to join that life. And she'd wrestled with it a little bit just because of not wanting to leave her family. But when she was 18, she did leave her family and join the Loretto nuns. And she says that after that, she has never had a doubt. She's never been hesitant. It's just been a joy. It had just been a joy for her ever since she made that decision. So she joined the Loretto nuns when she was 18, and she learned English with the intent to become a missionary. She got to go with the nuns to India and become a teacher for several years at a school near the convent. And after doing that for a few years, she felt a second calling. She felt that she was still called to be a nun, but she was called to go out and serve the poorest of the poor in Calcutta, India. So she had to get permission from the Archbishop of Calcutta and then from Pope Pius XII eventually to become an unenclosed nun. So she could leave the walls of the convent and actually go out into the city. So she continued with her vows of poverty and total service to Christ, but she was allowed to do that out in the city instead of inside the convent.
Yeah, I love that you said the poorest of the poor. My one of my dear friends and adopted her babies from Calcutta. And when she went, I think that was quite eye-opening to see this similar conditions to what we're going to talk about here with Mother Teresa is what her babies were born into. And so to see that, it's hard for us to imagine as Americans, we're pretty cozy. And so just trying to launch ourselves into that experience of ministering to the poorest of the poor. I think Muggeridge does a good job of drawing out that experience. So
I say for someone that wants a comparison, I'm reading anything by Amy Carmichael, who was also a servant to the poorest of poor in Calcutta. Totally different perspective and way of going about it than Mother Teresa. But those two women really did so much to serve the Lord. So for those who aren't familiar with Amy, she's a great devotional writer.
yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Amy because she also came from a very happy family, and that can sometimes be a blocker to us entering ministry. Again, it's really, if you have a really happy family, you kind of want to stay there and be with them. So I'm always amazed by the testimony of both of these women that they would leave their comfortable circumstances and their happy family to do this. So, all right, I think it's time for our break, Lee.
Yeah, so just once again, we want to thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, that makes it possible for us to be here each week. CC Books, sometimes what we call it, but classicalconversationsbooks.com is where the books discussed can be purchased. And we have the entire 2024 as well as the 2023 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at my website, leebortons.com, with links to my YouTube channel at Lee Bortons, where you can watch all the things that we've been talking about for the last almost 2 years. And it's been really fun to do this with you all. Next week, we're going to transition from great books of literature to more of a timely how-to book for classicalists. It's called How to Develop a Brilliant Memory by Dominic O'Brien, who just plain old person like we are and end up being a global memory master by working at something any of us could do while we're driving in the car or treading water at the pool. He was just really interested in developing his brain. So we will talk about him next week. And that might help folks who don't understand why we love grammar so much to begin to appreciate the benefits of it. So we look forward to that discussion next week. Okay, let's go on and learn more about Mother Teresa now.
Okay. So I don't know about you guys, but when I think about evangelism, I often think of something like knocking on doors, or when you think about missionaries, you're thinking about them preaching, teaching, sharing Bible stories. And that's not quite what we're going to find here in this biography of Mother Teresa. So it might seem strange, revolutionary, counterintuitive, all those things, but it also might be true that her approach is simpler and more Christ-like. So Tim, do you want to start us off by reading this passage where Muggeridge describes her way of evangelism?
Mm-hmm. Just because her faith is so sure, Mother Teresa has no need to be an evangelist in the old propagandist sense. She preaches Christ every moment of every day by living for and in him. Most contemporary Christian missionaries preface any remarks they may have to make about their work by saying that they would never dream of suggesting that Christianity is to be preferred over other religions, and look back with pitying patronage at their predecessors, who took more literally the command to go and preach the gospel throughout the world. Such patronage is misplaced. One day, in a different climate of opinion, due recognition will be given to the splendid achievements in evangelism and service of Christian missionaries in India, Africa, and other distant lands, by comparison with which today's tepid efforts will seem very meager. It would be absurd to suggest that Mother Teresa is neutral as between Christianity and Hinduism. Her preference is clear for all to see and understand. Yet she manages nonetheless to include high caste Indian ladies to participate in ever increasing numbers in her work.
It's so interesting that he equates evangelism and propaganda in the beginning, because we've just talked about him going and dealing with living in Russia and encountering propaganda. What did you guys think about that connection?
Well, I think he's saying that she doesn't use propaganda. She
Right.
actually believes it, right? So what's really interesting to me is that a man of his persuasion, who apparently is a seeker but not committed at this point, because I mean, I would think that's what's happening because of the history you gave us earlier. That when he says this, he reminds me of Anthony Eslin when he tells us people don't want us to talk to them in their language. They want to see us in action, speaking the words of evangelism of Christ. They want to see what in the world it looks like to really be a Christian. And then when they hear the words, they're actually honest and sincere. And so I think, so she could say, no, no, you need Christ. I don't care if you're Hindu or what, you need Christ. And then live that out so that she was respected.
Yeah, one of the things Muggeridge is really famous for is being a very harsh critic of anyone who he saw as being hypocritical. Like that's one of the things he was really known for, was not letting anyone get away with anything in his interviews. And so I think you see a little bit of Muggeridge's personality coming through in the way he writes about Mother Teresa, right? This perspective isn't unbiased. He's coming at this with a perspective of his own that overlays what he sees in Mother Teresa. And it's clear that he admires her a lot for her simplicity, right? Her integrity, that she doesn't just say, oh, we ought to evangelize, but she is living evangelism.
And she's living it to the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you got it, Stephanie.
I was just going to say she's living it to the point that even people who are Hindu, who aren't Christians, can see the truth in what she's doing. So she doesn't have to go and knock on doors and ask people if they know about Jesus. She's just living Jesus to the point that people see her and think, okay, this woman has the truth, because there's no way that someone could have this much joy and this much energy without having something supernatural and true about her. So she doesn't have to evangelize in the traditional sense, just because the way that she's living is such a testimony that it's clear that she has something real, and everybody can notice that.
I think what she had was that, and she says it in the book, that every person who was in her arms, every person she served was always Jesus. She just looked at them as Jesus. So of course she would talk to Jesus about Jesus. And I remember one time a friend of mine was really good at evangelism, and I commented on that to her. She said, look, I just assume they're already Christians, and I talk to them in the language that we speak in, and I assume they know what I'm talking about. And then, that they're just gonna be as glad as I am to talk about it, because then when they stop me and say, I don't understand what you're talking about, or I've never thought of that, there's like, they want to enter in the enthusiasm, and they are much more receptive to questions and being inclusive. And I think that's how she was.
Yeah, and that's that last statement, she manages nonetheless to induce high caste Indian ladies to participate, is maybe falls on our ears in the wrong way, again, as Americans. I mean, these women were trained from birth that the people that she was ministering to, lepers and abandoned children, these are untouchables. They're called untouchable, which means literally you don't touch them. And so for her to go around picking up these people and bringing them into her refuge and caring for them must have been so shocking to these high caste Indian women. And yet she does it in such a way that they start doing it with her. That's an amazing statement.
Well, we have so much context for that now after COVID, when the church shut down because you might get sick. Wow. And Mother Teresa, and I forget the guy's name, the leper priest over in Hawaii. God, what his name is right now. I mean, they're famous because they said, I'm gonna hold you while you're sick. And I don't care if I get the disease or not, because I'm gonna live even if I die.
Yeah. That sentence right before it too, Jennifer, it would be absurd to suggest that Mother Teresa is neutral as between Christianity and Hinduism. But again, the way that she shows her non-neutrality isn't by going out and telling Hindus that they're wrong. It's by going out in her habit, doing the things that Christ did to show how right Christ is. So she's not an arguing apologist. She's living, right? She's living up the apologetic. which is really amazing, and again, so powerful that it overcomes those cultural divides, because because Christ is because Christ is true to all people, to all men and women, no matter where they live, regardless of culture. And so she doesn't have to nuance her approach to living a Christian life because of where she lives. She just lives in accordance with the Word of God.
Yeah.
What do you think about her being dressed as a nun? Like, I think about that all the time. Why do we try to fit in with our clothes? Why are we not, as Christians, wearing something that says something different about us? So that's its own topic.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so she was living that out, dressed in the garb of a nun. So people, whether they knew of her or not, immediately had some sort of reaction to her.
Yeah. Well, and there's a whole, and this is associated with her clothing too, but there's a whole history behind her. So one of the first letters that they can find about Christians was written to a governor of one of the Roman governors of a province. And they said, hey, we're casting out these babies that are deformed, and the Christians are going out at night and picking them up. What should we do about it? Well, so she has this long, centuries old tradition behind her of Christians caring for these unwanted children. And also she has that history of the church behind her of caring for lepers. I mean, during the plague, who was caring for people who were dying of the plague?
Christians.
The Christians in the monasteries and abbeys were taking them in and taking care of them. So it's interesting that I see your point. I'm not sure what else to say about it, but it does set her apart, but it also sets her as part of that tribe of people who have always done this thing.
Yeah, think about it. His name was Father Damien, her kind of compatriot over in Hawaii during a similar time period.
Right. We might need more symbols of the fraternity to which we belong.
Well, I think about we were talking about being grandmothers and seeing little baby Violet earlier, and I'm so proud to be called Nana. I want my name to change to represent the growth I have in Christ. And my name changed when I became Mrs. Robert Bortons. Not that there was anything on my name, Lee Bryant, but I was somebody new. I was one flesh with somebody. Right, so your name changes, and so she became Sister Teresa when actually she had a totally different name when she was Albanian.
Right.
So there's so many things that you can learn from reading this book about someone who just doesn't care what anybody but Jesus thinks.
Yeah, I was also wondering what the rich young ruler would think if he met her.
Yeah.
She sold all she had, and well, we can keep reading because it's such a great book. So I think I skipped down. So Stephanie, I think you told us at the beginning that she didn't start off picking up people out of the streets of Calcutta. That's where she ended up. It's not where she started, but that first she was a teacher. And so when she decided to go out and branch out in this way, she tried to get some medical training and sought that out, because people do have needs, physical needs, not just spiritual needs. So if we think about that, we often use this analogy of thinking about, we wouldn't teach a starving child to read. We would first feed him, and then we might teach them how to read. So, but she goes even beyond that, something even more than food or medicine. So Stephanie, do you want to read us our next passage?
Sure. So she says, it is not very often things that the poor need. What they need much more is what we offer them. In these 20 years of work amongst the people, I have come more and more to realize that it is being unwanted that is the worst disease that any human being can experience. Nowadays, we have found medicine for leprosy, and lepers can be cured. There's medicine for TB, and consumptives can be cured. For all kinds of diseases, there are medicines and cures, but for being unwanted, except there are willing hands to serve and there's a loving heart to love, I don't think this terrible disease can ever be cured.
Mm.
I mean, it's a social disease, right? And it's one that is just as prevalent or maybe even more so today than it was in the slums of Calcutta where she lived. You know, we have teenagers taking their own lives because of this feeling, right? This disease of feeling unwanted, or maybe even knowing they're unwanted. And social media and the mass media markets are not helping that. They're making it worse. Uh, Loving them and knowing that they're cared for is super important. And maybe even more than that, to take it back to the last passage I was reading, is to let them know that Christ loves them and he will love them more than we can.
And this might be a really small and paltry, but when I first tutored Challenge 2 many years ago and read this passage, my first thought was for my students in Challenge community that it is really easy to pay attention to the ones who always come prepared and who always have a lot to say. And it really made me notice every single face in the room and want to make sure they knew that they were wanted and make sure that I called on them to give their contributions in whatever way that they could, and to maybe sometimes quiet down those latter ones because they also needed to listen. So
Yeah, that's greatly appreciated, Jennifer. And I think that's really a big difference between classical conversations and homeschooling parents in general, is that we're trying to really see the children that are in front of us. And great, you got an A, woo-ha, you get use the gift God gave you for its purpose. But what about those who need the courage to overcome because they don't have all the giftings that you have? So it's really nice to be able to spend a day a week looking for for what they need, isn't it? Right? And so that's what makes you such a knack teacher, that you see your students. So thank you.
well, and that's one reason why we only have 12 at the most.
Mhm.
It's if you have a classroom full of 35 kids, it's really hard to see them all. So
I know when I read this, I was convicted because I don't live in a community where there's a lot of homeless or even particularly really poor people. We live in the South where air conditioning's not all that needed, or heat, I should say. Food's abundant because there's farms everywhere. I mean, the cost of living is relatively low here. So I know that when I go to the city and I see, all kinds of folks on the corners and with signs and things, I actually don't know what to do. I don't see them. I'm sure I don't see them like Mother Teresa does. And I don't know if being around them more is the answer to that, or just helping to live in a community where there's no need for that, right? But there's both sides of the equation of service there. But I couldn't do what she did.
I have a friend who decided we live in a fairly affluent suburb, and so we don't see a lot of those needs. And this friend of mine was I think she was leading a Sunday school class of probably 15, 16-year-old girls, and they were pretty spoiled and isolated from the realities of life. And so she decided to take them down to the city rescue mission. And the first response was that they were appalled that people were not as clean as they had hoped they would be. And so she said, well, that's good. Lesson 1 complete. I'm going to keep taking you down there. And before long, she actually became a full-time missionary down there. And so her story to me is very similar to Mother Teresa's, that she has gone down, she has moved down there. She lives among the people that she serves, and she just tries to see and touch and love them every day. And that's been such a beautiful gift to me to just watch her. So it's still not my own story, but it is fun to have a front seat to see her do that so similarly to this story. So she gave up her comfortable life too, by the way. So good. Did
When
you have
it's interesting just that caring for people is monetarily free, right? Like you don't have to be wealthy to do what Mother Teresa was doing. In fact, she was poor right along with them. And so a lot of times I think that I don't have the resources to do what needs to be done, but the resource is love. And so like through Jesus, like we all have the resources that we need. Like Mother Teresa wasn't wealthy, that she had money that was given to her sometimes through churches, but that's not really what she was pouring from. She wasn't pouring financially, but she was channeling caring for the people and loving the people like Jesus. And so that's the disease that she was trying to cure, and we all have access to that.
Very good. Very good, Stephanie.
Yeah, absolutely. And then once you do that, once you start pouring out on the unwanted, usually what happens is you find yourself like Mother Teresa and my friend, and like the missionary George Mueller, you find yourself praying a whole lot that those other needs will be met. So you're pouring out your love and being physically present with everyone, and you spend a lot of time praying that the physical needs will be met. So good. Well, one of the things that I think always happens to missionaries is either they're pressured to give numbers of conversions and say this is what we're accomplishing, and sometimes that can be discouraging, and on the other end of it they're often criticized and they're saying, well, how can what you're doing possibly make a difference, because there's an ocean worth of things that need to be done and you're dropping little water droplets into a bucket. So maybe you should leave this up to someone bigger than you, like the government, for example. So Lee, do you want to read us this last quote for today?
Sure. I do not agree with the big way of doing things. To us, what matters is an individual. To get to love the person, we must come in close contact with him. If we wait till we get the numbers, then we will be lost in the numbers, and we will never be able to show that love and respect for the person. I believe in person to person. Every person is Christ for me. And since there is only one Jesus, that person is only one person in the world for me at that moment. That's the problem with, a very common phrase in modern times is somebody should do something.
Yeah.
Rather than I should do something. And that's what I think she's saying, that I can do it. If I go one person at a time, I'll do something. And maybe that's why she could, because she saw them one at a time. She didn't feel overwhelmed by the numbers. Because that's not what mattered. It was whoever was in front of her. And this really flies in the face with today's influencers and social media and just the things that, I always wonder about the conviction of Malcolm Muggeridge, because in many, many ways, the whole TV industry is the way it is because of him. He was one of the beginning folks in it, along with Walter Cronkite and Edward Murrow and the various owners of the big stations. And their whole point was to reach the masses with messages. And now we can compare that to Mother Teresa, and who probably served the most people the best, would be a
Well, I
question.
think it's the media reaches a lot of people, but none of those people feel reached in their hearts the way Mother Teresa could reach people. And so even thinking about the big way of doing things, like maybe letting a government or a program do something, maybe they do give a lot to people, but do the people feel the same way as they would feel when an individual ministers to them? Getting something from a faceless entity is so completely different from getting something one-on-one with someone, especially if that underlying need is really love or needing to feel wanted. You're never going to feel wanted by a program, but you can feel wanted by a person.
Yeah, I mean, even thinking about, the pleasure and joy you can get out of success, whether it's an artifact in the realm of art or winning a sports game or something like that. The action itself can be very satisfying. Being in that program can be satisfying, but it's always because of the personhood of either the creator of the artifact or the team that's around you or the audience that you're hoping will enjoy what's going on. People just really matter.
And then this goes back to that prior one to talk about being wanted, right? That that a small gift from a person who loves you and is giving it to you because they love you and they want to give it to you, that can be received with a kind of gratefulness that a check from a government program can never inspire in someone.
Well, the check from the government never inspires the word thank you.
No, and it doesn't inspire relationship or change, right? I mean, this is part of the key to Mother Teresa's evangelism program, right? Is to care for them so that they feel loved, so that they can feel the love of Christ through her. You don't get that through a TV screen or a form letter in the mail. You get that from someone sitting with you and caring for you and talking to you and listening to you.
Yeah. And I was thinking as we were reading it about, our in classical conversations, we have a very passionate commitment to having in-person communities meeting one day a week. So what's the difference between if I got up and had an online literature class and let's say 1,000 people showed up versus I show up and I have my 9 students on Tuesday who are together in person discussing these books together, and I'm hearing their struggles for the week, their excitements for the week. That's a different thing. And I think that's so it's our approach to loving people in Christ also, to be with them physically every week. And that's a different kind of efficiency.
To me, a big difference with online education is you use 2 senses. You see things and you hear things. But face to face, you smell people, you touch them. You can even taste the same foods or give them a kiss and taste them. Right. And so I don't want my children learning with only 2/5 of the senses the Lord gave them. I want them learning with all of their senses. Now, that doesn't mean the adults in the wisdom that we have can't, upon occasion, learn a whole lot from a book all by itself, or a radio show you listen to, or a Zoom call that you're on, or webinar. But to have that be the way that you learn for 18 years as a child, it just seems like it stunts their development. And I like Mother Teresa, need to say, nope, kid, you can sit on my lap and we're going to cry while we write this paper. And that is great education.
Yes. Or I'm going to watch your eyes light up when you finally
Yes.
figure out how to calculate the area of this strange looking figure that has just been placed in front of you. What that might have happened an hour ago in my house. So yeah, and I think I also would like to say a word to the homeschool parents who are listening to this episode, because I hope that her example is an encouragement to all of you. Sometimes we get discouraged by what's going on in the world around us and all those outer circumstances, or we start to hear that voice that says that what we're doing isn't important because there are just 3 or 4 kids sitting at our knee listening to us every day. And I hope that this discussion has disabused you of that notion, and that you know that what you're doing is super important to sit with your children around you, and that being with those 3 to 4 kids, or 8, I don't know how many you have, however many kids you have in your house, this small group that you're discipling, that every one of them is Christ to you too.
Yeah, it's a message that hasn't even been heard since the 70s, is that your children can be Christ to you. It's okay to go out and serve the great big world through a paycheck, but hugs and kisses somehow just don't rate. And I just really appreciate homeschoolers who have values that are swapped around. Because another thing that's just a really gift to modern times is most of us live pretty long now. And once your children are grown and gone, you'll have lots of years to go out and serve other people if that's what your family allows you to do. And there's also nothing wrong with being I don't know if I'd call her a stay-at-home grandmother, but maybe a travel-teach-home grandmother.
Yeah.
Right. There's still people to be loved, but the constraints of tiny little infants does not last. Oh, please give them all that you can until they don't need it. That's a good segue from you, Jennifer. I appreciate you thinking of our students and all this. Well, it looks like we're out of time, and I kind of want to end with just a little bit more information about Malcolm Muggeridge, his conversion in '88 that Tim opened up sharing with us. Was in line with also Mortimer Adler, who you're familiar with from the encyclopedia set. What's it called, Jennifer? Lost my words.
Great books.
Yeah, the great book set from Mortimer Adler. Lewis became a Christian. Muggeridge became a Christian. A bunch of mathematicians that were famous at the time became a Christian. So many people were becoming Christian out of this era that were in media, that Bertrand Russell, one of the most famous mathematicians of all time, wrote a book. He was friends with all these people becoming Christians, and he wrote a book called Why I Am Not a Christian, to explain why he didn't see what they saw. So I want to just end with that, because I think it's really important for our children in the Challenge program to know why they are a Christian, and to see so many other people become a Christian that they want to understand, explore why in the world they would do that. And if they're articulate enough to write a book called Why I'm Not a Christian, maybe that will change them too. So thanks to Muggeridge and his work that he did, and how we all have benefited from knowing more about Mother Teresa. Thank you, guys. See you next week when we talk about
Brilliant memory.
brilliant. See, I need a memory. Bye.
Bye, guys.